Breaking tonight, Australia's trade sovereignty just crystallized into action. Canberra didn't threaten, they implemented. Tensions are escalating across the Indo-Pacific tonight. China flooded Australian markets with artificially cheap steel, but instead of economic surrender, Canberra activated its trade defense mechanisms with surgical precision. Everyone believed Australia would remain passive in the face of steel dumping. Beijing expected Canberra to prioritize diplomatic harmony over domestic industry. Analysts assumed Australia would negotiate endlessly rather than act decisively. They were all utterly incorrect. The breaking point: Canberra, February 2026. Standing before Australia's Anti-Dumping Commission, Industry Minister Tim Ayres made a statement that reverberated across Beijing's Commerce Ministry. When trade is not fair, the government will stand up for Australian farmers, manufacturers, and workers. Translation: Australia just told Beijing that sovereignty over its domestic market is non-negotiable. And what happened next? The country that built a rules-based trade defense system reveals exactly why Australian industrial policy is reshaping Indo-Pacific commerce while predatory dumping strategies collapse. The steel tsunami that couldn't be ignored, dear viewers. Between 2023 and 2025, something extraordinary happened in Australian steel markets. Beijing pushed too hard. Australian manufacturers reached breaking point, and the Anti-Dumping Commission, professional, evidence-driven, and patient, began building the case that everyone in Canberra knew was inevitable. The numbers were devastating: 700,000 tons per year. That's how much fabricated steel China was dumping into Australian markets. Not selling, dumping. Steel ceiling frames flooding across borders at prices no legitimate competitor could match, no Australian manufacturer could survive against. The Australian Steel Institute didn't ask for protection. They asked for fair competition. Their emergency application late last year wasn't protectionism. It was a distress signal from an industry watching Chinese imports systematically undercut every domestic price point, not through efficiency or innovation, but through artificial pricing designed to eliminate competition entirely. The technical specifications tell the story: metallic-coated steel frames, height up to 45 mm, width up to 60 mm, base metal thickness up to 0.5 mm. Precise, specific, targeted. These weren't random products flooding Australian markets. These were strategic exports designed to capture market share through pricing that violated every principle of fair trade. Australia's measured response: here's what makes Australia's response extraordinary. They didn't retaliate, they investigated. While other nations might have slapped emergency tariffs immediately, Australia activated its Anti-Dumping Commission. Evidence-based, rigorous, transparent. Exactly the kind of trade defense mechanism the World Trade Organization was designed to protect. The Commission's mandate is simple but powerful: assess whether export prices are higher than normal value. Not politics. Not diplomatic posturing. Mathematical fact. And after months of investigation examining pricing data, production costs, and market conditions, the Commission reached its conclusion: Chinese steel ceiling frames were being sold below fair value. Not speculation. Not assumption. Proven dumping. Australia's response: a 10% tariff. Not the 50% the Australian Steel Institute requested. Not punitive tariffs designed to exclude Chinese products entirely. A measured, proportional levy that simply restores competitive equilibrium. This is what sovereignty looks like when exercised through institutions rather than impulse. The timing Beijing can't ignore, but here's where this story becomes fascinating. Just weeks before Australia announced its steel tariff, Beijing's Commerce Ministry made its own move: 55% duties on beef imports above quota levels. The official explanation: protecting Chinese domestic industry, not targeted at any specific country, according to the ministry. Just a coincidental safeguard measure affecting Australia, Brazil, and the United States simultaneously. China is Australia's second largest beef export market. Those tariffs weren't economic policy. They were leverage. And Canberra's message back to Beijing was crystal clear: if you weaponize trade, Australia will defend its industries. Not through escalation, through rules-based reciprocity. The WTO framework: Australia mastered Chinese Ambassador Zhao Kaiyan's comments at the embassy late last month reveal everything about this dynamic. We are both members of the World Trade Organization. Should we conduct any trade remedy practice, it's important to follow exactly the WTO rules. He's absolutely correct. And that's precisely what makes Australia's steel tariff so powerful. Because unlike arbitrary tariffs imposed through executive decree, Australia's action was conducted through the exact institutional framework, the WTO, designed for these situations. The Anti-Dumping Commission operates under WTO anti-dumping agreement provisions. Their methodology is transparent. Their evidence is documented. Their conclusions are appealable through international mechanism. Beijing can protest. They can complain about excessive use of trade remedies, but they cannot challenge the fundamental legitimacy of Australia's action without undermining the same WTO framework they invoke when it serves their interests. Australia didn't violate trade agreements. Australia enforced them. What this reveals about Australian strategy, this isn't just about steel ceiling frames. This is about the fundamental architecture of Australia's approach to asymmetric trade relationships. Watch how Canberra operates first. They build institutional capacity. The Anti-Dumping Commission isn't a reactive body created in crisis. It's a permanent mechanism staffed with technical experts, operating with clear legal authority, ready to activate when Australian industries face unfair competition. Second, they separate investigation from politics. Industry Minister Ayres didn't decide whether dumping occurred. The Commission did, based on evidence, insulated from diplomatic pressure, accountable to economic fact rather than geopolitical convenience. Third, they calibrate responses proportionally. The Commission could have recommended higher tariffs. They could have blocked Chinese steel entirely. Instead, 10%. Enough to restore fair competition, not enough to constitute protectionism. Fourth, they embed actions within international frameworks. Every step of this process was conducted under WTO rules, making it defensible in international forums and replicable across other trade relationships. This is what strategic sovereignty looks like when exercised by a middle power that understands institutions matter more than muscle. The broader pattern emerging, dear viewers, Australia is systematically demonstrating something that reshapes Indo-Pacific trade dynamics. Rules-based trade defense works, not through tariff wars, not through diplomatic threats, through evidence, institutions, and proportional responses that even the targeted nation struggles to challenge without revealing their own predatory practices. Beijing can complain about the steel tariff, but to do so effectively, they'd have to argue that Chinese steel ceiling frames weren't being sold below normal value. They'd have to claim the Anti-Dumping Commission fabricated its evidence. They'd have to challenge the WTO framework they themselves invoke constantly, which means Beijing's only real argument is that Australia shouldn't be allowed to use the same trade defense mechanisms larger economies employ routinely. And Canberra's response, silence. Because when you operate through legitimate institutions, you don't need to argue. The evidence speaks for itself. The Productivity Commission investigation, but Australia isn't stopping with this single tariff. The government has ordered the Productivity Commission to conduct a comprehensive investigation into steel dumping allegations, not a narrow review of one product category, a systematic examination of long-standing patterns. The final report is due in November 2026. Think about what that signals. Australia is building a comprehensive understanding of how trade distortions affect domestic industries, gathering evidence across categories, preparing institutional responses that address systemic problems rather than isolated incidents. This is how you defend economic sovereignty over the long term, not through reactive tariffs, through systematic institutional capacity that can identify, document, and respond to unfair trade practices as they emerge. Why this matters for Australia's future, here's what everyone watching Indo-Pacific trade dynamics needs to understand. Australia just demonstrated that middle powers can defend their economic sovereignty without abandoning rules-based trade. They can stand up to larger economies without escalating into trade wars. They can protect domestic industries without becoming protectionist. They can use institutional mechanisms to achieve what diplomatic pressure alone never could: legitimate, defensible trade adjustments that even the affected nation struggles to challenge effectively. The Australian Steel Institute warned that imports were pushing manufacturers to breaking point. The government didn't ignore them, didn't tell them to accept market realities, didn't prioritize diplomatic relations over domestic industry. They investigated, verified, and acted. That's the model every middle power struggling with asymmetric trade relationships is now studying. Because Australia just proved it works. The message to Beijing, and here's what makes this moment so significant for Australia-China relations: this wasn't escalation. This was clarification. Australia will trade with China. Australia will maintain diplomatic relationships. Australia will cooperate on shared interests. But Australia will not accept predatory trade practices, will not allow domestic industries to be eliminated through dumping, will not prioritize diplomatic convenience over economic sovereignty. The 10% steel tariff isn't punishment, it's a boundary. And Beijing, watching Canberra activate institutional mechanisms they cannot effectively challenge, is learning exactly where that boundary lies. What happens next? The steel tariff takes effect immediately. Australian manufacturers can compete on price again. Chinese exporters must sell at fair value if they want market access. The Productivity Commission continues its comprehensive investigation. More evidence, more documentation, more institutional capacity to respond to future trade distortions. And Australia, professional, patient Australia, continues demonstrating that sovereignty doesn't require choosing between trade relationships and domestic protection. It requires institutions that can deliver both. Dear viewers, this is how middle powers defend economic sovereignty in the 21st century, not through trade wars, not through diplomatic confrontation, through evidence-based institutions that restore fair competition while maintaining commercial relationships. Australia just showed the Indo-Pacific that rules-based trade defense works, and Beijing, watching Canberra activate mechanisms they cannot effectively counter, is learning that Australian sovereignty is non-negotiable. Drop a comment below. Should Australia expand these investigations to other product categories? Are we watching the blueprint for middle power trade defense? Join this community of informed viewers as we track how Australia reshapes Indo-Pacific commerce, one evidence-based tariff at a time. This is how sovereignty works when backed by institutions rather than impulse. And Australia just became the case study every middle power is now watching closely.